Iran is a game changer for the entire world. The fact that we're trying, it sort of seems as if the administration is trying to push it off the table is interesting because quite literally, it is a game changer for the world for the simple reason at first, and there's more to it than this, that when Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, it stopped the flow through it of about 20% of the world's oil, a little bit more than that of liquid natural gas, and of course as well about 30% of either fertilizer or the ingredients to make fertilizer, which is just a crisis. It is a crisis going, especially going into the planting seasons, and it's certainly a crisis in the United States, but it's really a crisis in developing countries. The whole issue of fertilizer is, and there's a lot going on with fertilizer and with crops that, again, is a really interesting way to look at the world. But I'm not going to do it today, although it's one of the reasons that I'm so fond of the agriculture committees in Congress. But with that closure of the Strait of Hormuz, you can't just turn off 20% of the world's oil. And have the world continue on as it was before. Now, long term, what this I hope will do, silver lining here, is will help the world recognize it must develop renewable energy, which, to my mind, has been on the table since the last Gulf crisis. But, Trump has worked very hard to stop our construction of wind farms, for example, and to stall solar and so on. Done it again this week. So in the long term, maybe this will be good for the world, but, in the short term, it's catastrophic for the reasons I just outlined, but it's catastrophic for the entire world in that we depend on that energy to make our economies work. And all of a sudden, Iran, which is, in many ways a deeply problematic state, controls it. And again, because Trump jumped in there, and there's always been this worry that they would do it, but it's never happened before. So nobody was quite sure if they were going to be able to pull it off, and it turns out they can. And now, you can see Trump sort of saying, I just won. And today his people were out in front of the TV cameras going, gas prices are coming down and the economy's roaring. And it's like, that's just a straight up lie. Because what we're seeing right now, we're just getting into is, when we talk about oil prices, the price of a barrel of oil, what they're really talking about is oil futures. They're saying, what is the price going to look like in, a number of months? And those oil futures are now at 110, a little bit over that today, at the close of the day, dollars a barrel for Brent crude, which is one of the many ways that people measure the cost of oil. Well, anything over 100, the world starts to shudder, and they're already at 110, and there's just no way to make up the oil that's missing. And, as economist Paul Krugman says, what's going to happen is what's happening right now is countries are using their reserves. And when those reserves run out, what's got to happen, because that oil doesn't exist, it's not on the market, is that demand, it's going to get so expensive that it drops demand. And when that happens, of course, economies all over the world are going to slow down, and they already are. But you're really seeing in places like Asia, China is already helping other Asian countries with jet fuel because they don't have jet fuel or they're running short of jet fuel. Well, imagine if we're all trying to bargain for the same jet fuel. You can imagine what the prices are going to do and what that's going to do to people traveling and what that's going to do to the economy. But here's the problem. Trump doesn't have a way out. There is not a solution to this Strait of Hormuz issue without him backing down and basically looking like he's made this huge blunder. Well, when is the last time you saw Trump back down? This is not something he is capable of doing. So, he keeps sort of saying it's going to open, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And we don't know, obviously, what he's going to do in the future. But one of the acronyms that is circulating now, you've heard of TACO, Trump always chickens out. Now you're hearing NACHO, not a chance Hormuz opens. And even if it does open, like very, very quickly, like tomorrow, which it can't do for many reasons. But even if it could, the damage to the economy is already going to happen, because there's already that big gap in having that oil in the pipelines, if you will. And I meant that metaphorically, not really, but it's also not in the real pipelines. And that is, we are just at the point now, a little bit over it, where the oil that came out of the Gulf, that area of the Gulf, before February 28th, when Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel attacked Iran, right at that point, we're just running through that oil. And now we're getting into the more expensive oil coming in. And, I left this house 9 days ago, maybe 10 days ago. Gas has gone up in the gas station. Before we hit the highway, gas has gone up 25 cents in those 9 days. And that's not going to get better in the course of this summer, which is when people usually use a lot of energy because they're on vacation in the United States, because they're on vacation. And, this is a real problem. So you've got that going on with Trump, and there's no way that I can see that prices are not going to continue to climb because of that crisis that's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. So you've got that adding in there. But then there is also, and by the way, the war is enormously unpopular already. Only about 34% of Americans approve of the strikes on Iran, while 61% oppose them. And by the way, the price of oil right now is the highest it has been since June 2022, which was shortly after Russia's President Vladimir Putin attacked Ukraine that was February of 2022. By the way, I usually use Russia's president instead of Russian president. I usually always identify a leader as the country rather than that person's, using it as a modifier for that person, simply because sometimes you have leaders who are not actually from that country. So I learned that from my friend Nadia, who might be watching. So that's why I talk about it a little bit differently than a lot of journalists do. All right, so you have that going on. You also have the problem of the fact that Iran is enormously expensive. It's about $1 billion a day. And it now turns out that the administration has not been honest about all the damage that was done to American military bases and installations and infrastructure around Iran, in the Middle East, when Iran was striking back against neighboring countries after those initial strikes. And that the estimates for fixing that are at least $5 billion as well. So this price tag is going up and up and up. At the same time that the Republicans are saying that there isn't money to do things like, provide supplemental nutrition assistance programs or health care and so on. And I don't know about you, that's not sitting real well with me. And I suspect it's not sitting real well with a lot of people, but we're not done. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth testified today in front of the Senate and yesterday in front of the House, not actually theoretically about the Iran war, but rather about the upcoming budget struggles. But in fact, he was asked quite a bit about Iran, and his answers were those of a Fox News host, which is not acceptable to the members of Congress who sit on the armed services committees. And that includes Republicans as well as Democrats. And they're very upset about the firings that Hegseth has engaged in. Most recently, two pretty dramatic firings of the Secretary of the Army and of the Secretary of the Navy. And it's pretty clear that Hegseth is trying to gather power into his own hands, but it's also really quite clear that he is not in step with the idea of an apolitical military, and that, he's really not trained to do what he's doing. He's a former Fox News host, and it didn't go well for him today in front of the Senate. And it did not go well for him yesterday in front of the House. Nonetheless, the Republicans today in the Senate rejected Adam Schiff of California's proposal, the sixth proposal now by the Democrats, to stop the war in Iran, and put a pin in that, because there's something else big on the table right now with regard to Iran, and that is that, Trump launched that war without consulting Congress, which is a real overturning the instructions in the Constitution about the declaration of war, which Congress is always supposed to be consulted in. But in 1973, after Richard Nixon had bombed Cambodia, remember that? He just went ahead and decided to bomb Cambodia. Congress put up sort of a wall around that with what's called the War Powers Act. It's the 1973 War Powers Act. And in that, they took on the argument that Nixon had made, which was that it was an emergency and he had to do it. Well, it really wasn't, but that's what he said. And what they did is they wrote a law that said, listen, if the president has to act for an imminent threat, that is, if another country is about to bomb us, in that case, he can do whatever he feels the need to do. But he has to inform the Congress within 48 hours in writing. And then once he has informed Congress in writing, he has 60 days in which he can operate. And at that point, he either has to get authorization from Congress or he has to withdraw his military efforts from wherever he is, from that specific operation. Well, Trump launched that attack on February 28th. I don't actually remember when he, off the top of my head, when he informed Congress. I mean, it was obvious, right? But you have to do it in writing. You can't just say, oh, I thought you knew it from the news. So that's 2 days. So that gives him 62 days from February 28th to when he must have congressional approval. Guess when that is? Tomorrow. That's May 1st. And that's a really, really big deal because a number of Republicans have said, we'll give you 60 days, dude, but then you're done. And today, of course, they backed off on that and they said, we're not going to stop you now. But today, in front of the Senate, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth tried to say, well, the clock stops running if you've got a ceasefire. And Tim Kaine, a senator from Virginia, went, no, it doesn't. That's actually not what the law says. So we are going to see, I think, over this weekend, a really big fight over whether or not Trump can continue to make this war in Iran. And obviously Republicans have a real issue here because this war is enormously unpopular. They don't want to stand behind it, but they also don't want, I mean, some of them do, but not all of them do. And they also don't want to say no to Trump. So, and the Democrats are going to continue to hammer this, and they're going to continue to hammer it not for partisan reasons alone, although that's certainly there, but because I cannot impress enough on people how incredibly important it is for our system that Congress is ultimately the group to decide whether or not we go to war. That is in the Constitution. It's something to which we have adhered, at least in name. Let me explain the difference between a war and an authorization of a declaration of war and an authorization of military force. A declaration of war tends to be the whole society goes to war. You switch your economy, you have a draft, taxes go up, there are war bonds, and you're really putting all of your effort into the war. An authorization of military force tends to be less than that. Simply Congress saying, yeah, you can go ahead and whack away at one problem or another, but we're not going to turn the entire country toward that war, which, I think we can argue about whether or not that was a good idea. I'm not going to argue about it now, but that's the difference between the two. The reason that the framers of the Constitution insisted that it must be Congress that decided whether or not the nation would go to war, the declaration of war belongs to Congress, was because they were exceedingly concerned that if a leader were able simply to take a nation to war the way monarchs had in Europe, it would be a very short period of time, first of all, before the people were impoverished, paying taxes to support that army, which I think is a lesson we should have learned in our modern era a long time before this, but also because it then very quickly endangers American lives, of course, but it endangers our very ability to have control over the direction of our country. And so they wrote that into the Constitution, and it is fundamental, not just because we may or may not want our family members fighting, but also because if we take a nation to war, if we take our nation to war, we are dedicating not only our lives, but also our treasure to that war. And Trump has simply done that. If you think about 60 days at $1 billion a day, 62 days at $1 billion a day, plus the damage done by Iran in those first days of fighting, we're already looking at about $65 billion that has gone into this military adventure. And I don't know about you, but there's a lot of things that I can think we could have used $65 billion more for, that it would have more effectively used those $65 billion on things that matter more to the American people than Trump's war of vanity. That being said, again, there really isn't a way out for Trump except to back down, because as Paul Krugman, the economist, said today, even if Iran and Trump could come up with some kind of a negotiation, some kind of a deal, why would Iran trust him when he keeps tearing up the deals he makes? And the answer to that is there's no reason at all. So we're in this now, and seem to be in it for a while.